Welcome to Science of Slink, the evidence-based pole podcast with me, your host, Dr. Rosy Boa. And just to be very clear, I'm not a medical doctor. I cannot treat or diagnose. I'm the type of doctor that does research and reads research articles. And that's part of what we're going to be doing together here in the podcast. We're going to be reading research. We're going to be synthesizing that down into things that you can apply to your pole practice. We're going to be talking with experts in their field and learning more. And overall, just really building our understanding of how bodies work, how we can do pole better, train more effectively, train more safely, and just have a better time overall. So if that sounds like something you're interested in and you want to come get a little bit nerdy with us, come on in. Welcome to the podcast. I guess you've just heard the intro. I don't have to reintroduce the podcast. But I do have to introduce today's guest, which is Melanie Stucky. I never know how much y'all who are listening are reading the articles that we talk about. But we talked with Stephanie Greenspan a while ago, and she and Melanie have co-authored a bunch of stuff together. So if you've been reading, Stephanie's oeuvre, you will also have come across Melanie's work. But do you want to talk a little bit about who you are, your background, your sort of movement life, because I think it'll come up. And then we also have a specific paper that you had that just came out that we're going to dive into a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. So, my name is Melanie Stucky, and I am a circus researcher. I started pole dancing way back in 2007. So I've been through a whole bunch of variations of what pole dance is, from like the very beginning of like come to one class a week, and that's all that's really available, through competitive stuff, through regional, national, international competitions, and eventually tons of instructing from 2009 up until then. And then I opened my own studio in 2018 and closed it in 2020 with the pandemic. Went online for a little bit and then ended. But along the background of all that, I was also doing grad school, and I was doing my graduate work in kinesiology. Originally, I was really interested in cardiac rehab and like really like nitty-gritty physiological things like heart rate variability, but at the same time also exercise prescription and using technology to support things. So really focusing on behavior change and how do we actually get people to adopt new behaviors. And once I actually finished my PhD, I was a bit iffy about going on in research, but I ended up sort of taking a shift in my career and working as a scientific writer for a mental health hospital, which was super interesting because it gave me a really much broader understanding from like, I'd done a bit of sports psychology type things, but then really opened up to like mental health, mental illness, and a lot of different things around there. But around the time that I opened my studio, I also really was interested in how to make pole dance instruction safer. How do we support instructors better, and how do we do all that? So as I was opening my studio, what better way to open a studio than to also decide that now's the time to do a postdoc? So I Googled circus research, and I found out that there was a circus research center in Montreal, and I sent a random email asking if I could come and work with them for a little bit to do a very short-term postdoc, because I wanted to learn about risk and safety and health around instructing specifically for pole dance, but I knew they had like a good circus instructor training program and coaching program. So I thought that there would be some way to sort of work that in. And so I ended up coming here to Montreal to do that. And then there was the pandemic. So instead of doing a short-term here and having a studio, I did a short-term studio and a long-term stay here in Montreal doing research. So that's where I am right now. I am a researcher for CRUTAC, which is a French acronym, but essentially the Center for Research of Circus Arts. That's based with the National Circus School, or ENC, as a lot of people know it by. And I do research in human performance and in social innovation. And since I sort of sit in both of those buckets, they come together a lot, where I'm really looking at bringing sort of the equity, diversity, inclusion, social change into human performance as well. So that's me.
I think a really perfect fit for the podcast, right?
I hope so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think really, really blending in a lot of stuff we talk a lot about, pole, but also, the larger social and broader context of movement and how we're moving our bodies. So let's just dive into this paper a little bit, and then I have it on a screen to the side, so you all see me looking to the side. I'm referencing it. And then just like see where the conversation takes us, because I think that there were, as an instructor and also a social scientist, recovering social scientist, I think I'm going on like the other direction of Klein as you are. I think a lot about society and social interactions, and it is something that certainly thinking about like my personal training certification and like the exercise science training I've had, very little discussion of the social aspect, maybe a little bit of psychology, a little bit of like particularly like looking for signs of overtraining in clients, a little bit there, and then a little bit like, hey, don't give your clients heat stroke, right? If it is 100 out, like it's been recently where I am, that's about 40 for other folks.
It's been that here in Montreal too, actually.
Yeah.
I hear it.
Very cool and normal that it gets that hot now everywhere. But the sort of like larger step back, more, I'm looking for a word that's not Gestalt, but Gestalt view of movement and physicality, I think is one that I think a lot about. So this paper really hit for me. And let me tell y'all the name of the paper, and it'll be down there. You know how I do. I always post links to papers and citations. It is 4 domains for development for all, or number 4, D for all, no spaces, a holistic physical literacy framework. So I think the first thing that I think is going to be helpful to talk about is, what do we mean by physical literacy? Because I think people know like literacy, right? Like you can read and write in a language. You may have heard of like numeracy, maybe, so like being comfortable with mathematical concepts. You may have heard of like digital literacy, so being able to like find and cite and evaluate sources, but physical literacy may be something that is new to folks.
Yeah, and physical literacy is probably exactly what you would expect based on the general definition. So similar to being able to read and write as literacy, or being able to do math as numeracy, physical literacy is really about being able to engage in movement. And as you might also imagine, might be kind of a thing as, as new concepts are brought to society and attempted to be implemented in a very good way, people don't always really wrap on to the whole thing. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about physical literacy, but they'll be talking about a really small component of it. And in that case, usually it comes down to physical competence. So there's actually physical literacy, I guess, if you want like an actual definition of it, is essentially the confidence, motivation, knowledge, understanding to be able to engage in physical activity across your lifespan. So there's actually there are actually 22 different definitions for physical literacy. So I'm sort of using the one that we used in the paper, which has some background, but you'll also come across many others because this is how things work in science. But the cycle that goes with this definition that we've come with starts with sort of the idea of competence or skill. And then there's a bit of a cycle that goes up to confidence. And there's a little feedback loop. So as you build more competence and you build confidence, that helps you build more competence. So your confidence and skill kind of link together. And as that sort of grows, then we get increased motivation. And the more motivation you have, the more active participation you have. So that's the really basic cycle of physical literacy. There's also a couple of sidebars that come on where we've sort of tacked in self-determination theory. So there's things around relatedness, autonomy, or agency. And then we've also tacked in things like fun, pleasure, and enjoyment, which a lot of times those get forgotten about in movement settings because we get really hyper-focused on step counts and intensity and time and reps and all these things. So we want to make sure that fun enjoyment is a really, really big driver for motivation. Not a surprise, but it often does get left out. So that's the basic cycle. And I've kind of described it in a way where it's all positive. So you build competence and it builds confidence. But of course, depending on how you're choosing to teach it, you can build competence, but be eroding confidence. And then that can decrease motivation and decrease active participation. So what we really want to make sure we're doing is implementing physical literacy in a way we're actually keeping that cycle moving and not stopping it. So that's physical literacy.
Yeah, I think that plays really well into what we were talking about the 2 episodes ago with Sally Riddell. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She does a lot of work on body image dancers and mirrors, and looking at, sometimes using mirrors can help students build specific movement patterns. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it hurts, but at the cost of lower body image, and in particular thinking about perfectionism as a tendency that can have some very negative side effects on the mental health of movers in general. And also, like, I think something that you bring up in the paper that I think is really helpful is that, like, it can also be a negative feedback loop, right? Like, if you're made to feel incompetent, if you're made to, try things that you have no hope of success at doing, then that's going to make you, it's going to make you feel less confident. And then you can have this sort of negative spiral as well. It's not like a ratchet effect. And as soon as confidence goes up, everything else goes up,
Absolutely. And there's a lot of ways that instructors can feed into that either building or eroding of confidence. Some ways that we think are really obvious, like being mean or, telling people they suck when they can't get things. But there's also ways that people can be very confidence eroding when they kind of take the credit. Like, someone will get something and they'll be like, oh, I'm such a good instructor. Like, it's not really, sure, it's your win too. You are a good instructor, but maybe have your celebration after and let this be about the student winning and let them build their confidence this way. So there's sort of sneaky ways we can do that too. But one of the things you mentioned was the idea of giving people things they can succeed in. And that's a piece that comes into this framework as well. It's a concept that was, I guess, first published by Philip Jeffries in 2020, so it's not that old. But he's also a resilience researcher, and it's the concept of the construction of positive challenges. So it's around building positive challenges that really work on this physical literacy cycle and do so in a way that it also builds resilience. So the idea is to pick a challenge, which it sounds very like common sense, I think, but there are things that we don't actually do. A lot of times it's like to pick a challenge that's at a level that's individualized to each person. And it's at a level that they're going to have to struggle with a little bit, maybe fail, but is achievable. And depending on, I would say for myself, depending on the level of students or the experience that they have, will depend how much they're going to struggle and how much they're going to fail. So certainly with like your very first pole class, I'm probably not going to be like, I'm going to make you struggle all class and then suddenly fail and get a success at the end, right? Like with a more beginner person, you want to see them be able to succeed a lot. So you want to be building those little challenges where they can build their confidence, have success, and then be able to actually feel successful and want to keep coming back. So continue that active participation. So yeah, those are the construction of positive challenges that we want to be aiming for in class. And importantly, this is where it falls apart a lot in things like gym class, probably pole classes as well, is where we kind of have one challenge for the class instead of having challenges at the levels for each individual in the room.
Yeah, which I have structured my classes in a way to make that possible. I understand that that's not always possible. And also, I'll be frank, it's harder, right? It requires a really deep understanding of, especially if you want everybody to be working towards kind of the same thing, it requires a really deep understanding of not only like how to do the thing and how different people might do the thing in different bodies, but also like where are different people likely to struggle and for what reasons, right? So, great example here, thinking about a pole sit, right? I've had students who just don't have a lot of body fat and they really struggle with the pole sit because they struggle with the grip. So for them, it's really a strength issue of being able to like squeeze their thighs together and get that grip. I have had other students where that is very much not the problem. The grip is fine, but getting their legs up in the first place is the real challenge. So those two students are going to be, potentially struggling with the same movement, but in very, very different ways. And being able to like identify that as an instructor and then during curriculum development, be like, okay, if I have, these types of people, I need to be able to develop curriculum for this in a way that's not, I mean, you want to be individualized, but it's also a challenge in group class because I can't give everybody one-on-one time 100% of the class like I would with individualized coaching or personal training. So it's hard, but anecdotally, I have found that students enjoy themselves more. I don't know, sort of a very broad way to put it, but
no, I think that it's part of the physical literacy cycle if we go to the expended one, so they need the enjoyment. So I think it's great. But I agree, it definitely does make it much more of a challenge for the instructor. And I think one of the important things, and this is where we get into the 4 domains, is that those positive challenges don't all have to be physical challenges. So in the 4 domains, we have physical, psychological, social, and creative.
Yeah.
So yeah, we included creative in there because it's so important in movement. I feel like physical, psychological, social people kind of get, like, we need to have obviously physical competence. That one nobody's going to argue about. I think psychological, no one's really going to argue about either. As a note for that, we include both like the mental health and wellness, but also the cognitive skills. So, some ways that you can create positive challenges for people if you're working on like a pole sit, maybe some of your more advanced students are working on different pathways into a pole sit or different pathways out. So really working on sort of that cognitive idea of what grip points do I have and how am I transferring grip points, and then also the creative challenge. So we can also have that. And then social is also another one. So you could also play with, like, does somebody need a social challenge? Like, is there someone who wants to be working on leadership? I don't mean that as a social challenge. I know that could come out wrong, sorry, but thinking about different social skills like leadership, or if you have a student who's come to you and said that they really are interested in becoming a teacher one day, but they don't even know where to start, then maybe some of those leadership challenges are important to start adding in, or to just let people be leaders in the class. It doesn't have to be only the advanced students. It's really great to have the less advanced, I suppose, students also be able to be leaders and share some of the stuff that they've learned about how they've achieved different things in their bodies. And that is a great boost for confidence as well. So you get to hit a couple of different domains in that. But yeah, there are different ways that you can structure those positive challenges so that it's not just a matter of how do I put a sit at a level that's going to challenge every different one person physically.
Yeah, absolutely. I particularly wanted to talk a little bit more about the creative challenge because I'll be frank, I don't think all types of physical training have that, really. So again, thinking about, personal training in a gym, you may or may not have an opportunity to move creatively there, particularly if you're doing something like, I don't know, Olympic lifting, where like there's a very prescribed format, like you're trying to do something very specific with your body. And what that looks like is, very structured. But I think it feels a lot more natural with something like pole, something that is artistic, that has this artistic component to it and sort of has from the jump. Yeah. I don't know, something I think a lot about is this is a tangent, and we can get back off of it and come back. But I mean, you've been around for, I'm sure the hashtag not a stripper days. I'm very glad the community's moved past that. And also there was a time when a lot of the pole community that was online was specifically trying to have pole seen as a sport and not as an artistic endeavor. And I think there's still people for whom that is their goal. And I'm not necessarily going to say that that is wrong, but I think that it is not in keeping with the roots of the art form to strip it of that sort of, self-expressive, creative side, which is, I mean, frankly, so much a part of stripping, right? Because part of it is that you are selling the experience of hanging out with you and like highlighting your great personality and how beautiful you are and how wonderful you are to hang out with and how expensive you should be, right? Which requires creativity and requires self-expression in a way that, Olympic lifting does not. Tangent.
Yeah. Building on that tangent, I suppose, I think one of the interesting things about creativity too, and I totally agree, like I absolutely adore the expressive side of pole. That's one thing that's kept me coming back to it in all of the times that I've had like I've never really like dipped right out of pole and back in, but I've definitely had times when I'm like, oh, I'm so tired of just like skills and pushing and blah, but I can just dance and have fun and be free. Like there's so many different ways to use pole, I guess, or dance pole or train pole, that it actually gives you like a lot of nice creative breaks. And there's ways that you can be like creatively train or creatively structuring your practice as well, right? So there's of course that like really obvious way that we think about creativity where it's like movement and expression and dance and all those things, but there's also a lot of other ways that creativity kind of comes in. So I've actually never thought about it in the Olympic lifting kind of way, so I'm going to think about that more. But definitely we've thought about it a lot through other more traditional sports like hockey. There's like a slap. I don't know that much about hockey, so I'm not sure why I chose that as my example, but there's like a slap shot, there's stick handling, there's things, but there's also, you're never going to be in a competition where the same thing happens every single time. So you need that creativity to be able to make decisions, right? So someone with less creative problem solving or decision making ability might get a bit overwhelmed if there's suddenly like 4 people coming at them on the ice, whereas someone who's more skilled in that might be able to like creatively find a new path out of there. So yeah, definitely there are ways to use creativity in times when it doesn't work as well. But I would also think that like there's a time for creativity in pole, but there's also creativity in like the very technical parts, right? So even if you think about like learning the very first, I don't know, pole spin, where you don't really get that much creative expression because you're just learning like hold on to the pole here and here, like put pressure here and here, use tension, engage the, well, you're probably not using exactly those terms, but, and then go and pick your feet up or whatever. There's still some creativity, like it might end up being on the instructor side to be able to like adapt different moves to a certain person. And there may be less creativity right at the beginning, but as it starts to move on, as that person starts to get to know their body better, they might be able to make some of those creative adaptations too. And I'm not very well. I did Olympic weightlifting with someone for like 2 sessions, so I don't know that much about it. It was so fun though. I would love to have a space to go back and do that again. But I don't know, maybe there's creative ways that you can like be able to think through problem solving for yourself. So if you're not getting it, what does that mean? This might be going off on more of a side tangent, but there's also like a couple of different types of training, right? So there's like directive training where as the instructor, you're like, put your hand here and here, do this, lift this, do this. And then there's decision training where it's much more open and there's a bunch of different skills. And one of those is like self-feedback. So that's one way of training creativity too, in some ways. It also the psychological for the cognitive. But if you do something, then instead of saying like, okay, here's the 3 things you did wrong, so correct those, but like, what did that feel for you? Like, how does it feel? How do you think you could change it for it next time, right? So it's getting them to sort of do that creative problem solving as well. So creativity in this model doesn't have to be just those very specific dance and move and flow and try and do something different that you've never done before, although that's definitely a part of it as well. But it's also through that decision making, problem solving, and all those things too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of great points, and I'm trying to decide which one I want to sort of like tug at a little bit. I think probably the one that is floating to the top for me right now is that, you know, I think you sort of hinted at it, but a big part of being good at being in a body is not going to be visible, right? Like I have certainly, you know, I've worked with people who are like extremely fit, they can do a lot of things, but they don't have a strong connection and understanding with their body. They haven't really developed their interoception. They haven't really developed, well, maybe they have pretty good interoception and pretty good proprioception, but that skill of reflecting on their movement without external feedback from somebody else and having that sort of self-reflection about why they are moving and how they're moving and what they could change and how that might affect things down the line, I think is one that not everyone is consciously developing and that not all styles of training encourage you to consciously develop. So I think it's I don't know. I think it sounds like that would fit sort of both in the creativity a little bit and also the psychological. Sorry, I'm looking at the quadrants here.
Yeah. The other thing that's like really important about the 4 domains is we call out the 4 domains, but they are not at all separate. Like you can really hardly ever work just one at a time, especially like once creativity gets thrown in there, like creativity is going to have a physical psychological component for sure, quite possibly a social if you're working with other people or sharing your creativity with an audience. Like we can talk about a certain domain, but they're almost always going to overlap. So that's part of the beauty of it too.
Yeah, and I think it's a helpful model because it forces you to think about more than I don't know. Something that came up for me when I was reading this is I don't know how familiar folks are going to be with this outside of the US, but in the US we have something called the Presidential Fitness Test that was developed to make it easier to draft people. They're still doing it, but it's basically like you got to run a mile and as fast as you can, and do a bunch of sit-ups and do a bunch of pull-ups and like a toe touch. And like for some people, that's like the first flexibility instruction they ever receive ever, and a lot of them have negative experiences with it. So if you teach a lot of students from the US, you may be dealing with a little bit of the background radiation of that, unless they were very fit, flexible children, which was not my experience going through life. Let me put it that way. And that's easy to measure, right? Like all that stuff, I can count how many sit-ups you can do in a minute. Very straightforward, very easy to look at. Much more challenging to be like, all right, how well do you understand, this movement on the inside, right? Like, could you do a bunch of sit-ups at an angle, right? Like if I put one butt cheek up and started making it weird, how well would you be able to deal with that? And I think that zooming out a little bit from just like sets and reps and splits and stuff is really helpful, both as an instructor but also as a mover, right? Because I think that it can also be really challenging as a student, particularly in a mixed level class, if you are not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most skilled and experienced in the class, to look around and be like, they're doing such stuff that I would like to be able to do. But, looking at the context, like how long have they been doing this? What else do they do in their life? What did they come into class with? And sort of zooming out further to the context, right? Like, do you have similar, ability or disability circumstances, right? Like something that comes up for me a lot is I'm dyslexic, so I train both sides, so I don't have to remember which one's my good one. But if someone's trying to give me instruction and they're like, oh, put your left hand here, especially if I'm in the air, it's not helpful for me, and they might assume that I, not knowing that, they might make assumptions about me as a mover that are not a good reflection of my skill, right? So holistic.
Yeah. So two things that came up there. One of the first things which I'm thinking about from actually like the physical literacy definition. Oh, one of them anyway. There's like Margaret Whitehead is a philosopher who really like brought physical literacy back in the late 90s. But one of the big things that's really important to her in her philosophy around physical literacy is the idea of embodiment. And building a relationship with movement. So it's really about all those things you were saying about the introspection, about understanding your body as a mover, about being able to like negotiate for yourself through class. Or whether it's class or through your own movement. It doesn't have to be a class, obviously. If you're like out for a walk in the woods, can you like negotiate your body through different challenges? So that's one thing. The other thing that came up when you were talking about like having some really fit individuals and some really not, and how this fitness test probably scarred people for life when it comes to physical activity. Our physical education classes did that too, so we don't even need the big test in Canada. But that's another thing that I think is really important for like pole dance, any fitness instructor, but since we're talking about pole, let's stick with pole for now. To understand when people come in is that people bring in whatever they're bringing in with them. And so I know that there are like, if you do an internet search, I'm sure the majority of pole dance studios that come up on your internet search, their purpose is to empower people. And I wouldn't say, having been in many of those studios, that they're actually taking the initiative, I suppose, to actually consciously take the steps to make their studio actually be empowering. And just imagining that coming to pole dance and we're like, oh, we can move kind of sexy now if it's that style of studio, which not all studios are. and it maybe feels empowering, but like, how are you actually keeping that going? And if you have a whole bunch of people coming into your studio who have been bathing in the social fitness culture, diet culture, purity culture, they are bringing that into your studio, whether it's the instructor, whether it's the students, whoever. And if you aren't consciously doing something to shift that into something that is an empowering culture, something that is a body positive culture, um, people are bringing that in with them, as well as like their skill levels of whatever that they're bringing in. So one of the big things, like, this framework is really like, it feels super common sense, but like the big thing about it is like you have to make conscious decisions or it's just falling back to the default.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think currently a lot of the default borrows a lot from Western commercial dance training traditions, which I have lots of feelings about. I think there are very, I'm not going to say there's none. I would say the majority of probably studio owners and, you know, people who are developing pole curriculum, their first experience with dance is not with pole. Their first experience with dance was in a very structured pedagogical classroom. I'm thinking of ballet, right? Like we can just say it. Which, if any of you have not taken a ballet class, it is very, I'm just going to say authoritarian, right? There's like a specific way to do things. You do it together at the same time. You can see that your leg doesn't go as high as the person in front of you. And then perhaps someone comes around and pokes you with a stick and tells you you're doing it bad. That did happen to me when I was very young. Yeah.
It's awful.
Yes. But I think that is not an empowering experience for anybody but the instructor. Right? That is removing agency and autonomy and self-direction from movers and forcing them, or trying to force them, to move into a very specific mold. And I understand why they do it, because if you want to get a job doing ballet professionally, that is the mold that you need to fit in. And, you know, as much as I think that it's not necessarily a great thing for all of the individual people who come in contact with it, I understand that that is something that is on those teachers' minds, and that they are genuinely trying to provide good professional training to students who are interested in doing that. But if we're thinking about our adult students, I don't teach anyone under 18. I know some folks do. That's, I think, a discussion for another day. Are you doing the same thing? Are you trying to teach them to move exactly the way that you want them to move, right? Do you want like a row of dancers that are all doing the exact same movement in the exact same way, and like where it's very clear that like, oh, you know, this student who just started is obviously, I can visually see, not doing the same thing as the rest of the students, even though they're trying to. And again, that's not empowering those students to move in their own way. That is creating a framework of comparison that I think some people enjoy and thrive under. Some people really like competition. Some people really like, you know, being able to see themselves improve against other people. I'm not one of those people. And I think it's really worthwhile. I'm mostly talking to instructors here, but also like if you're a student and this has been your experience and you're like, I didn't like that, there are other ways of learning pole, and you don't have to have that, right? Like that's not how I teach. That's not how a lot of people teach. And I really encourage you to find a place that really fulfills your needs and like you're excited to go to, you have a good time, and you feel really valued and respected. And if you have that already, fantastic. I'm very happy for you. And if you don't, keep looking. You got other options. Anyway, that's to the students. And to the instructors, maybe think about that. Maybe think about why you want your dancers to be cookie cutters. Is there a reason?
I totally agree with you. And I'm probably going to take us off on another little tangent here into more of the program evaluation world, which I also love. Like this is how much of a nerd I am, one of my biggest regrets of closing my studio, other than the people that was obviously the saddest, but I never got to do a program evaluation in my studio, which is honestly, I think, so important for being able to know, like, if I say that my studio is going to be empowering, am I actually doing that? And just like, I know that not every studio is going to be full of clientele if their goal is actually to do the things that I love and the things I think you love, like freestyle and creative movement and all of those wonderful things. And so I would just say, like, that's cool, but maybe just don't promote it as empowerment. Like, if you really intentionally think through, like, what's your purpose for going here? Why will people come here? And I know there are studios around here too, where like their focus is on competition. Like it's a big thing to be part of the competition circuit. And I'm probably going to put these letters in the wrong order, but like IPSF, International Pole Sport Federation, like they do like those style of competitions where it's like literally if you aren't in exactly the right pose, you did not do the move. And so that's cool. Like it's not, there's nothing wrong with teaching that way. It's just like being intentional about like, am I teaching this way because the goal of my students is to get there? Or am I teaching this way, but also saying that I'm all about empowerment and being connected with your body, and then saying like, no, don't stop, do 3 more, right? Like, no, are you listening to your body? Can you do 3 more? So just like having the same messaging as action.
Yeah.
Integrity, I guess.
Yeah. And I think it's also helpful for students, right? Because like I've got my values on my website, right? I think if someone reads them and is like, wow, this lady's off her rocker, I just want to learn how to look hot. Like I'm just not going to be the instructor for you. It's fine. We're gonna like evidence-based is on the wall. It's on the website. We're going to talk about the research. And if you're like, this is a waste of class time, then listen, there's people who aren't nerds. You can find other people. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. And sorry, that look for those who are watching on the video is a flashback to other work experiences that I've had. Yeah. Anyway, so we talked about the 4 in the middle, which is the domains. But the other thing that I'd like to touch on before we wrap up, which I think is probably more often when people think about holistic, are the contexts. So you want to talk about them a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So essentially, like if you look at the whole 40-40 for all model, like you were saying, there's like this little center that has the 4 domains. So that's essentially the individual is right at the center of things with their 4 competencies. And then just outside of that, we have the movement context. So in a pole scenario, that would be the pole studio. And then outside of that, we have the social context. And then outside of that, we have the physical context. So the idea is that the individual is embedded in these 3 different contexts. So physical would be like, I'm in Montreal, it's hot today, it's sweaty, it goes from being hot and sweaty to dry and cold, just like that. And those physical factors affect my polling, obviously. Which type of grip do I need today? Who can tell? There will be like the 2 weeks in the spring and 2 weeks in the fall when I don't need grip, fabulous. And then the rest of the time, it's a toss-up between chalk and glycerin. And then inside of that physical context is the social context. So we talked about that a little bit. That can be like diet culture, fitness culture, purity culture. It can be systemic injustices, just those small things, but it's those big things that are affecting people. And so when you are creating the culture or the environment of the movement culture, which would be, not necessarily the student's role, but an instructor's role, a studio owner's role, those are the types of things you need to take into account as well. So the idea here too is that like there's some great theorists from either longer ago or not so long ago. So Bronfenbrenner, whose first name I can't remember right now, and then Overton, whose name I also can't remember. But Overton did relational developmental systems, and Bronfenbrenner did like an ecological system. So the idea is that people are affected by their context. Again, this feels like a no-brainer that I'm saying it, but it happens. People are affected by their context. So very often, if we think about general public health campaigns, at least here in Canada, I'm sure they're similar in the US, the idea is that you are either healthy or you're not. And you're going to have to be healthy if you want to be a morally responsible person, essentially. But leaving out the fact that so much of what's actually affecting that person's health and that person's actual ability to participate in movement is the context that they're in. So how dare you not manage to fit in 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous intensity activity when you must work 2 jobs to be able to put a roof over your head and food on your table and spend time driving your kids around to all of their activities, or just don't want to work 40 hours a week, right? Like the context is not set up for that kind of success. And that's bringing it back down to the pole studio. There's also things to think about about like what social factors are impacting the students in your class, whether that's, like we said, fitness, diet, purity culture, whether it's certain people's like social injustices that they're facing, whether it's racism, classism, sexism, all of those things. How are they affecting the class? How are they affecting what's coming in? I know a really big topic a while ago that kind of like pops up and down is how ethical is it to have all women's classes, or how unethical is that? So making your decision if you're going to do that or not, like what is the social context around that that's driving it? And then, yeah, how are you either, again, it's not to say that you have to make, what's the word? Exceptions is not the word, but you don't have to be addressing every single one of these things. But you should be aware of them and then consciously choosing which ones you are, so that if someone were to ask you like a question about one of them, you have a way to back up, and not a question like whatever, but like, why are you choosing to do this or not? Like, I guess a big one would be aesthetics. Like, why do I have to use white supremacist aesthetic of ballet? Let's just throw that out there. Is there a good reason? Is it because it's a competition-based studio and I'm assuming that you've read my values on my website, it's my goal, and you're coming here because you want to be a performer, a competitor, and that aesthetic is really important for those contexts? Or have I just not really thought that through and it's just one of those, it's my preference, right? And like the biggest thing I hear is, oh, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent now on
No,
aesthetic.
I think this is great.
Okay. The biggest thing I hear when people are like, oh no, you have to have pointed toes and straight legs, is that like, that's how you know people have body awareness. And as someone who, I did do ballet as a kid, and I will tell you that pointed toes and straight knees is not a body awareness. That is a very deeply ingrained movement pattern. I love playing around with like gnarly toes and gnarly legs, and the extreme decrease of skill of what I can actually perform on the pole while I'm doing those, because I have to put so much of my attention into not just doing the default of pointed toes and straight knees, is wild. So if you are really worried about building body awareness, make people play with different things, and then you can also be empowering because you can give them the opportunity to choose which one they like the most for themselves. So those are the contexts and a tangent or two.
Yeah, I mean, they're tangents about the context, right? Yeah, something, I mean, I'm in the South, so something I think a lot about is how much of what we are told is sort of, no, I shouldn't say that. How much of the feedback that people get from competitions in particular is like specifically, we don't like the thing that extremely successful and, you know, popular Black strippers do, right? Like, if any of y'all ever get a chance, definitely there's some wonderful strip clubs, specifically in Atlanta, I would say is like, I don't know, it's a cultural juggernaut. Y'all know what Atlanta strippers are like, right? Why wouldn't you? But like, that style of pole is just very, very different. And I remember when like PSO in specific was like, you can't hang from the tresses, which is like a huge part of that movement culture. And removing that, you know, means that a lot of these dancers aren't going to be able to showcase the skills that, you know, that they're working on. So, or I've seen some, I don't want to get too much into twerking, because I think it's a related movement discipline that does have some overlap. I don't think pole and twerk are synonymous by any stretch of the imagination, but I think a lot of the I don't know, sort of negative discussion I have heard of twerk is perhaps not intentionally, but functionally very against the sort of movement tradition that has been developed by Black dancers in the American South. Yeah, and it's, you can ignore that. You can choose not to interrogate that, but the people in the you know, social environment around you are going to notice that you are doing that, and the people who are going to notice it the most are the people who are hurt by it, right? Again, so you're talking about gender, like I'm I'm queer. Like I set out from the beginning to be, you know, a queer inclusive space, which means all genders are welcome, and I'm very, very upfront about that. And you know, something that for me is like, am I going to be into this space or not? Like, do they say something about gender, or do they just assume only cis women are ever going to show up? Because that's that's an assumption that you are making, that, you know, people who may have reason to interrogate are going to look at and be like, you making this assumption tells me that you have not considered, you know, the needs of a diverse range of students. Or you have, and you're just not telling anybody about it, which is maybe worse, because that tells me that the side that you came down on is actually, I want to intentionally exclude some people, but I don't think I can get away with saying it. No, I don't know. Maybe that was a little bit sassy, but...
I like sass. I think it's good. And I think sometimes we need a little sass just to work through some of these things, right? And we need, we need people who are standing up for those things, because it is so easy. Like, thinking about, I'm trying to think through the different trainings I've done. I've done a number of different like instructor trainings, and I cannot remember one that was actually gender inclusive. Like, I think everything is just like, if I read back, it's about the women in your class, the women, you know, and like so much of the stuff around, like if you were even teaching like a lap dance or something, it's like about dancing with a man, and it's about like, it's very, very cis hetero. And if that's the training that, I hope it's changed by then. I haven't had to do an instructor training in a while, so I'm hoping that it's changed, but I'm not 100% confident that it has. But if that's the type of training that people are getting, and if like, even thinking about when I first did my training, which was in 2009, so please, I hope it's changed since then. Like, it was all about, like, yeah, the languaging was very, very cishet, and yeah. And it was like, to pass the exam, you were like encouraged to like word for word, like shift it a little bit to match yourself, but you really wanted to like be very close to the wording. So if that's what you've been really, and even thinking about my instructors, like, yes, my instructors were from many years ago starting, but it's been years of like hearing the same stories and the same cues, right? So for sure, as an instructors who have been in the pole world for a long time, there's going to be a lot of very deeply ingrained movement cues, movement context. So again, it comes back to that like intentionality and consciousness. Like, do you choose now to consciously make a different choice? And do you choose now to consciously switch? And I say that with very much humility, as I've chosen to switch many times, because I, for sure, way back was this instructor that was like, point your toes. It's not right if you don't point your toes. That was 100% me. It's not me anymore. I was 100% the instructor who was like, this is the right technique. This is the wrong technique. I've learned, I've done better, right? So a lot of it is around like, you learn something new and you make a choice to change, and just give yourself compassion and love for the one that you were before, and change and do different going forward.
And I think, you know, same thing with your movement, right? Paying attention to it, thinking about it, all comes together. Yeah, I definitely, I started out as a, you know, many years ago, a ladies instructor. I was like, what should I call students? It's ladies. I don't do that anymore.
Yeah, we can all grow, and it's great.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that is, you know, both as individuals, as instructors, and as movers, and that growth is going to happen in a situation. We are not models, like statistical models in a plain white box. That's just not how it works.
No.
Okay. So if folks want to read this paper, it is open access, which I appreciated. It is 4 Domains for Development for All, a holistic physical literacy framework by Agans, Stuckey, Kearney, and
Creelers.
Thank you. I was like, that looks like Dutch. I'm not even going to try.
It is Dutch.
Yeah, Dutch vowels are territory. I'm just going to walk around. I'm going to avoid. And the link is down there below. So go give it a read, think about some things. Definitely feel free to continue the conversation, because I think, I don't know, it's important to think about things. That sounds like a weird thing to say, but I think it's sort of like one of my core ideals as a person is that, we should think about things, and maybe when we think about them, we're like, nothing needs to change. And maybe when we think about them, we're like, actually, this could be better. Oh. All right. Anything else you want to let folks know about, or if they wanted to follow your work and learn more, where should they do it? And what would you like folks to go do after this?
Sorry, I didn't mean to laugh at that. I am horrible at sharing my work, I admit. I'm trying to get a bit better at it, but you can follow me on Instagram at melirene13. That'll maybe be linked somewhere.
In the show notes.
Perfect. And I also have a sort of more of a business page that's something that's just sort of carried on from my studio, so has a bit more information as well, or discussion, a different kind of discussion, I guess, also on Instagram, and it's at the Volair Life. And we'll throw that in the show notes too, so I don't have to spell that out for you.
Well, thank you. I think this has been a really great discussion. We didn't even talk about the pre-professional circus students paper, which I would definitely recommend people read. Lots of interesting stuff in there. Period. I'm not going to tell you what the interesting stuff is. You have to go read it. I'm giving you homework.
It's also open access, so
yes.
You're good.
Yeah, which again, I really appreciate. Not having to email people and be like, excuse me, no. can you send me this, please?
We'll do our best. One more thing I'll shamelessly promote is I'm also the co-editor-in-chief for a journal called Circus, Arts, Life, and Sciences.
Oh, yeah.
And we have also published one of Joanna Nicholas's pole dance papers recently. But that is my dream journal, because it is on the open access train where you don't have to pay to submit, which is by the way, if you for us to publish open access usually costs 3,000-ish American, which is 5,000 Canadian, unless somebody's university happens to have an agreement with it. So that's why it's not always open access, but email the author. Or if you are doing research, you can look at the Circus, Arts, Life, and Sciences journal, and you can read it all for free because it's open access. And yeah.
I have very much been enjoying it. So thank you for your efforts on that front. All right. Well, I'm going to wrap the episode up here. Thank you for joining, Melanie. Folks, go follow on Instagram. She says she's not good about sharing her work. She does share her work on Instagram, and it's very digestible and easy to read, even if you're not going to read the whole paper. So go give her a follow. And I will see you all in the next episode. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something. If you want to do more research on your own, if we talked about specific studies, I always try to have the citations in the show notes so you can check them out for yourself. A great place to continue our learning. Speaking of continuing your learning, if you do want to work with me as a pole instructor, I teach online at my online studio, Slink Through Strength, and it would be great to have you come join us. I teach freestyle flow, I teach conditioning, I teach flexibility, and I teach pole in the nerdiest way possible. But we have a good time, and we'd love to have you join us if that sounds like fun for you. And if not, no worries. Either way, I'll see you in the next episode. Have a good one.